I'm Helen Crawford. I turned 72 last April, and the day my son handed me a birthday card at the airport, I should have noticed his hands were shaking. My suitcase was already out of sight. The crowds of Rome pressed in from all directions, but my heart was right back in California, standing barefoot in my rose garden. I had packed for the trip of a lifetime, careful not to forget the lavender sachet or the 2 small gifts for my grandchildren. The airport's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting my reflection on every shiny surface, and for a moment, I looked like any other tourist. My phone battery blinked red. My passport felt too thin in my pocket, and the only voice I could hear was my son's soft, distant telling me to just relax, Mom. By the time I reached the arrivals hall, all I had left was my own name. Before we get started, let me know in the comments if you've ever trusted someone you love with everything you have, and make sure to subscribe if you believe it's never too late to stand up for yourself. I was born in Bakersfield, California, in a house my father built when gas was 29 cents a gallon, and neighbors still brought casseroles over when someone got sick. I learned early that kindness didn't cost a thing, and that you earned your keep by working hard and telling the truth. I grew up the oldest of 3 girls, the one who always stayed home to help Mama shell peas or walk my sisters to the corner store. We didn't have much, but we had each other, and that seemed like enough back then. When I married James, we saved every penny he brought home from the shop, and when he got sick and the money got tight, I went to work at the hospital, folding sheets and emptying trash cans at night. I raised my son Mark mostly on my own after James passed. He was always sharp, always restless. The kind of boy who wanted answers to questions I never thought to ask. I gave him everything I could: birthday parties with homemade cakes, new shoes every September, even if it meant patching my own long evenings reading stories when I was bone-tired from the late shift. I thought those years of scraping by and holding on had taught us both something about gratitude, about how to make do with what you have and look out for your own. But I see now that what you teach a child and what they learn aren't always the same thing. When Mark called me about the trip, his voice sounded softer than it had in years. "It's your birthday, Mom. I want to do something special for you." He said Italy, and I almost laughed. No one in our family had ever been farther than Reno. I packed every good blouse I owned, bought little bookmarks for the kids, and walked through my house touching the photographs and the old yellow teapot, hoping this was the year things would finally be different. Stepping out into the Roman morning, the air smelled like strong coffee and dust, and I felt small in a city so old it made my own life seem brief. My son had handled every detail, or so I thought. When I reached for my phone to check the hotel address, the screen flickered, then died. The feeling that settled over me was colder than the airport's marble floor. I stood still just for a breath, suitcase forgotten at my feet, listening to the distant rumble of voices I couldn't understand. And I realized I'd never felt further from home. The airport didn't feel real at first. I stood beneath the high ceilings, listening to the language I couldn't follow, feeling the cold edge of the marble under my hand as I tried to remember which direction to walk. My suitcase was already gone. No one could tell me if it had even made it off the plane. I reached for my phone, hoping to find Mark's last message, maybe something with the hotel's name, or even a kind word. The battery icon blinked twice, and then the screen faded to black. In my purse, I found only my passport, a credit card Mark had said would work overseas, and 2 $20 bills tucked into the lining, the way my mother used to hide grocery money when times were lean. There was no printout, no map, no slip of paper with an address. The only thing I recognized was my own handwriting, faded from an old note I'd left for myself, in case I forgot where I'd parked back home. I tried to keep calm, standing near a window, watching the crowd swirl past, searching for a familiar face. My son's voice echoed in my memory, telling me to let him handle things. He'd insisted I let him book the hotel, keep the itinerary on his phone, handle the documents. Just relax, Mom. I've got it covered. I remembered the moment I handed him my wallet and the way he'd tucked it into his bag, already half turned away, impatient to get going. All that trust, so easy to give after a lifetime of holding everything together on my own. Now I was here holding on to nothing. At the taxi stand, I found a driver willing to help, though neither of us spoke more than a few words the other could understand. I showed him the name of the hotel, scrawled in shaky letters on the back of my boarding pass. We drove through streets lined with orange trees and laundry hung out on second-floor balconies. Rome looked like a place from a travel magazine, golden in the morning light. But my chest was tight as I tried to remember what Mark had said about the hotel, something about ivy on the walls. The driver stopped in front of a narrow building. The sign above the door matched the name I'd written. But inside the lobby, the young woman at the front desk shook her head and checked the computer twice. "No reservation," she said. I spelled my name, asked her to check under Mark's, then stood back as she made a call to the airline. After a few minutes, she returned, her voice softer, her eyes careful. There was no reservation. There was no return flight home. I stepped outside, finding a spot on a bench shaded by a cypress tree, and listened to the hum of the city. It didn't sound like music, not that day. It sounded like something closing in. I could feel the blood pounding in my ears. All I could think of was how Mark used to look for me at school. Pickup, how he'd run to me as a boy waving a painting he'd made certain I would always come for him. Now it was me waiting, searching for any sign that someone cared whether I got home. I tried to piece together what had happened, replaying every conversation from the week before. Mark's sudden warmth, his insistence that he'd take care of everything, the way he avoided my questions about the hotel and the flight. He'd planned it all. He knew I would be alone here. I thought about the birthday dinner, just the two of us at a restaurant so cold, I kept my coat on. Mark on his phone, barely looking up, stepping out for a call that lasted almost the whole meal. I paid the bill, walked out into the night, and tried to convince myself he was just busy, just distracted. But standing in the shadow of a Roman park, hungry and lost, I knew it had been something else. I sat on that bench for a long time, clutching my purse in my lap, thinking about how many times I'd put Mark first. Selling my wedding ring after James died so Mark could pay for college. Taking every extra shift at the hospital, bringing home day-old bread and leftover soup from the cafeteria. Skipping my own meals so he'd have enough. Telling him over and over not to worry, that I could manage, that he was meant for better things. It was as if the years had been leading here to this moment in a city where no one knew my name. I wondered if Mark expected me to call for help, to beg him for money to come home with my head down. I wondered if this was his way of testing me, or if he'd simply decided I was no longer his problem. In my head, I heard the things he'd said to the family, lately comments that didn't make sense at the time, how I'd lost my keys, forgotten to pay the gas bill, told the same story twice. The stories he spun were starting to look like a net, and I could see the shape of it now. He was preparing for something that required me to be out of the way. A young couple sat down on the other end of the bench. The woman's accent reminded me of home, the round vowels of the Midwest. I asked to borrow her phone, careful not to sound desperate. She handed it over, her hand warm, and I dialed the one number I remembered, my friend Martha back in California. I told her I was safe, that I needed her to look in on the house, that I needed her to call my lawyer. I asked her to water the roses. Martha didn't ask questions, just said she'd handle it. I walked until I found a small cafe, its awning faded the inside, bright with the smell of coffee and fresh bread. I asked the barista if I could borrow a charger or a computer, explaining in slow English that my phone was dead. She offered me a seat near the window and brought me a tiny cup of espresso. I sat there, trying not to shake, watching people come and go. I used the cafe's Wi-Fi to check my email on a borrowed tablet, grateful I still remembered my old password. There it was, a string of emails from Mark to the rest of the family, painting me as forgetful, unstable, unable to manage on my own. He had written that I repeated myself, that I was losing track of time and money, that I needed supervision. Each message a seed of doubt planted in people I'd known for decades. I read those messages over and over, my hands trembling, realizing that Mark had set this up long before my birthday. The trip was never a gift. It was an excuse to prove I couldn't manage on my own. With control of my accounts and my home, he could petition the courts for power of attorney. He could decide where I lived, how my money was spent, what happened to everything James and I had built. All he needed was proof that I was helpless. But I wasn't helpless. Not yet. I wrote to my lawyer, Harold Daniels, asking him to prepare for a challenge. I told Martha to stay by the phone to keep an eye out for anything strange at the house. I sat in the cafe as the light shifted across the tiled floor, thinking about all the ways my life had narrowed, all the trust I'd given that had never been returned. The barista offered to call a cab for me, and I took her up on it, pocketing the last of my euros. I watched the city fade by the window, the buildings tall and ancient, the traffic a steady hum. I thought about the difference between surviving and being cared for, about how many times I'd told myself that love was enough. My mind kept returning to the feeling of my son's hand on my shoulder at the airport, the quick pat, the forced smile, the lie behind his eyes. As night fell, I found a quiet place to sit near the station, my back to the wall. I breathed in the smell of smoke and old stone, letting it settle in my chest. I remembered every promise I'd ever made to James, to Mark, to myself. I told myself I would get home. I would not give Mark what he wanted. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang. I sat in the shadows, clutching my bag, and waited for morning. The night felt endless, but as the city quieted, I began to think about what I would do next. There was a way back. There always is, if you know how to look for it. Dawn in Rome arrived, softly pale light slipping through the narrow window of the tiny pensione, where I'd taken shelter for the night. I hadn't really slept. Each time I closed my eyes, I drifted back to Bakersfield. My father on the porch, the sound of sprinklers on the lawn. Mark as a boy in pajamas. His small hand wrapped around my thumb. That memory would linger for a few heartbeats, but then the ache in my shoulders and the weight of the previous day brought me back. I sat up, rubbing the stiffness from my neck, listening to the city wake-up church bells, echoing a motor scooter, rattling down the alley, the scent of baking bread floating up from somewhere I couldn't see. My mind circled around the same questions all morning. How did it come to this? Had I missed the warning signs or just ignored them? The truth was, I'd spent my life giving everything I could for Mark, sometimes giving more than I had. Now I was here 72, halfway across the world, without a place to go, or a soul I could trust, except for a friend thousands of miles away, and an old lawyer who might be my last hope. The fear sat heavy, but it wasn't the only thing there. Underneath was something sharper: anger at what had been done to me, and shame for having trusted so blindly. I knew I had to keep moving. After a quick wash, I dressed in the same clothes from the day before and tucked what little money I had into my bra for safekeeping. The streets were mostly empty. I stopped at a bakery and, with the help of a kind-faced woman behind the counter, spent a few euros on a roll and a coffee. The bread was still warm in my hands as I sat by a fountain, letting the quiet rush of water ground me. I thought about the things I'd sacrificed for my son, selling my mother's sapphire brooch, skipping meals, working holidays so Mark could have a normal life. Each memory came sharp and clear, but now there was an emptiness where pride used to be. Even so, I kept remembering the way Mark had smiled at me on graduation day, the way he'd hugged me when he got his first job. Maybe for a while he'd meant those smiles. I let myself sit with that possibility, even as the hurt ran deep. The morning wore on. I tried to piece together a plan. First, I needed to find a way home, but I couldn't risk reaching out to Mark or anyone he might influence. I checked the tablet again at the cafe, watching as new emails from Mark rolled in messages to my niece, to my brother-in-law, even to my friend Martha. His words were careful, but I could see the story he was weaving, painting me as forgetful, claiming I'd been slipping, saying he was worried about my well-being. It stung reading the things he'd said. It wasn't just that he'd lied. It was that he'd chosen to do it quietly, planting seeds of doubt before I ever boarded the plane. I could feel the net tightening, and I realized how easy it would be for others to believe him. I was just an old woman far from home with no proof to offer but my own memory. For a while, I sat in the cafe, watching people pass, their voices a blur. The couple from the night before came in, the woman giving me a little wave. She sat nearby, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, and after a few minutes, she leaned over. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice gentle. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. We sat together in the morning light, the comfort of her presence like a hand on my shoulder. She didn't press for details. When she and her husband left, she slipped me a small piece of paper with her number in case I needed anything. That kindness nearly undid me. It had been so long since I'd let anyone help. The day passed slowly. I spent the afternoon wandering the side streets, careful to avoid crowds, always keeping my bag clutched tight. I bought another coffee and tried to rest in the shade of a church. My thoughts ran circles, replaying old family dinners, Mark's laughter around the table, the way he used to beg me for one more bedtime story. There had been good years before time and grief and distance changed everything. I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere along the line, I'd lost my place in his world, that he saw me not as his mother, but as an obstacle. As the afternoon sun dropped, I called Martha again, using the Wi-Fi in the cafe. She sounded tired, but determined. "Helen, I checked on the house. Nothing's been touched yet, but there was a letter from the bank. I called Mr. Daniels like you asked. He's already pulling your files." I thanked her, relief and gratitude mixing in my chest. I told her not to worry, that I would be home soon. We both knew I was lying. There was no guarantee, not yet. When the call ended, I stared at my reflection in the cafe window. My face was drawn and pale eyes rimmed with red, but there was something else there too. A stubborn line to my mouth, the memory of my own mother's resolve. I realized then that I had to find a way home, not just for myself, but to protect everything James and I had built. Mark could write whatever story he wanted, but I still had a voice, even if it was quieter than it used to be. As the sky darkened, I returned to the pensione. I counted out my money and made a list of things I'd need to do in the morning, reach out to the U.S. Embassy, find out what I could do about my missing reservation check again for flights. I was tired to the bone, my hands aching, but I forced myself to keep moving. One step at a time, I told myself the same way I used to tell Mark when he was little and scared. That night, I barely slept. I lay awake, listening to the hum of the city, letting the past wash over me. I thought about my old life in Bakersfield, about the home I might never see again. I thought about the years I'd spent building a life for Mark, all the times I'd put his needs first. There was pain in those memories, but also strength. I wasn't helpless. I still had choices, and in the morning, I would start to use them. The morning air was cool as I stepped out onto the street, my purse pressed close against my side. I headed for the cafe where I'd borrowed the tablet the day before, watching the city wake up around Me delivery trucks rattling over cobblestones, a street sweeper making slow work of the curb pigeons pecking along the sidewalk. My hands shook as I ordered a coffee, the words coming slower than usual, but the barista smiled and set a little cup on the counter. I took it to a corner table, tucked myself in, and waited for the world to quiet down inside me. I logged into my email again, reading over Mark's messages to my family. Each line told a careful story, how I'd lost track of bills, forgotten appointments gotten turned around in familiar neighborhoods. He wrote about his worries, painting a picture of someone in decline. The more I read, the clearer it became. This wasn't a simple misunderstanding or a son worried about his mother. Mark was setting the stage for something bigger. The emails to my niece Claire and my brother-in-law Walter were polite, almost affectionate, but I could see how each word worked to cast doubt. The pattern was there if you knew how to look for it. My chest tightened as I scrolled. Mark had thought of everything. He hadn't left me here by accident. He wanted people to believe I couldn't manage on my own, that it was only a matter of time before I made some mistake that cost me everything. It was a kind of erasure done quietly, one small step at a time. But I could see the shape of it now. I sat there, hands around the warm cup, letting the feeling settle in. The years I spent caring for Mark, making sure he never went without always putting his needs first, those years mattered. I still knew who I was. A voice startled me from my thoughts. "Are you all right?" It was a woman probably in her late 50s, with silver streaks in her hair and a kind, steady look in her eyes. She wore a blue scarf knotted neatly at her neck. I managed a small smile, shook my head, and then nodded. Words were still tangled up inside me. She pulled out the chair across from me without waiting for an invitation and sat down. "I'm Linda," she said, her voice low and sure. "You don't have to tell me anything, but if you want to, I'm here." We sat together for a moment in silence, the clatter of dishes and the soft hum of conversation swirling around us. I found myself telling her pieces of my story, how my son brought me here and left, how my hotel reservation had vanished, how there was no return ticket home. I told her about Mark's emails, the quiet campaign to convince my family that I was slipping, not quite myself anymore. Linda listened without judgment, her hands wrapped around her own cup, her eyes never leaving mine. When I finished, she nodded as if she'd heard stories like mine before. "My friend went through something similar," she said quietly. Her nephew started spreading doubts too. Next thing she knew, her house was gone, her accounts locked. She reached into her purse, took out her wallet, and slid a few bills across the table. "I have enough for a plane ticket," she said. "Let me help." I hesitated, the habit of refusing help too strong to break all at once. "You're not letting me do anything," she said, reading my mind. "I'm offering. There's a difference." She pressed a slip of paper into my palm, her phone number in looping script, and closed my fingers around it. For a long time after she left, I sat in the cafe, the bills and the note resting quietly in my lap. The act of kindness felt heavier than any insult. It reminded me that even in a city where I didn't speak the language, someone could still see me. I called Martha again using the cafe's Wi-Fi and told her what had happened. She promised to keep an eye on the house and stay close to the phone. Then, with a trembling hand, I emailed my lawyer, Harold Daniels, and wrote exactly what was happening. "Mark is preparing to petition for power of attorney. I need to challenge him as soon as I'm home." That night, I found a cheap flight home booked by Linda, who texted to make sure I got the confirmation. I packed what little I had and spent one last hour looking at the city through the pensione window, watching headlights sweep over the old stone street. I didn't sleep much, but it didn't matter. There was a new feeling growing in me, a steadiness that had been missing for a long time. I might have been stranded, but I wasn't helpless. I still had a voice. I was going to use it. The next morning, before the sun rose, I left for the airport. The taxi driver helped me with my bag. His own quiet kindness, another small reminder that the world wasn't made entirely of cruelty. As the plane took off, the city of Rome spread out beneath me, bathed in gold and blue. I thought about everything I was leaving behind and everything I needed to protect. Mark might have started this, but he wasn't going to finish it. Not without a fight. Landing in California felt like stepping back into an old dream. My body ached with exhaustion and nerves, but I was awake now more than I had been in years. When I turned on my phone, a message from Mr. Daniels was waiting. He'd already started the paperwork to block Mark's petition. I could hear the strength in his voice when we finally spoke. "We're ready," he said. "We're not going to let him take anything that belongs to you." The flight home felt longer than any trip I'd ever taken. I sat by the window, watching the clouds drift by my hands folded in my lap. Each time, the engines hummed louder or the cabin lights flickered, I reminded myself I was finally headed back to my house. My own bed, the things I'd tended and protected for decades. In the quiet dark, I kept thinking of Linda, the slip of paper she'd pressed into my hand, the way her kindness had cut through all the noise of fear. She had booked the ticket herself, refusing to let me pay her back, telling me simply, "Call when you land. I want to know you're safe." The words stuck with me as the plane touched down and the crowd moved slow through customs. Everyone fumbling for passports and luggage, everyone eager to be home. It was nearly midnight when I walked into the arrivals hall, my suitcase dragging behind me. My phone buzzed as I turned it on, catching a steady stream of messages, one from Martha, checking in, a couple from Mr. Daniels confirming he'd filed the paperwork to block Mark's petition. There were other notifications too. The last was a video sent by Claire, my neighbor's daughter. I watched it in the harsh glow of the airport lights, my heart pounding. The shaky footage showed Mark in my foyer, laughing with a woman I didn't know. I could hear their voices, him boasting about getting everything signed before I came back. Her giggling as she spun a pen in her fingers. Behind them, a man stood with a clipboard, the notary. Mark held up my house keys, waving them like a trophy. "She's not coming home," he said, voice so sure it chilled me. She can barely remember her own name. I stood there, suitcase forgotten, listening to the echo of those words. In the background, the camera caught Mark leading the others down my hallway toward the bedroom I'd shared with James for nearly 30 years. The ache in my chest grew sharp and cold, but I didn't let myself look away. I pressed the play button twice, 3 times, letting every detail settle in. My own son was going through my drawers, searching for trust documents, the gold bracelet James had given me, all the little things that held meaning only in our family. I pulled in a breath and called Mr. Daniels right there in the airport. He answered on the first ring. "Helen," he said, his voice rough but steady. "You're safe now. We're in front of the judge first thing in the morning. The restraining order is ready. You just need to sign." He told me not to go home, not yet to wait for the police escort. I listened, nodding, feeling every year of my life settle across my shoulders. But there was something different inside me now, something that didn't bend, not even in the worst of it. A taxi brought me to a hotel not far from the courthouse. I barely slept. I sat up at the little desk, my hands wrapped around a mug of stale coffee, reading the motion Mr. Daniels had sent. There was an officialness to the language that calmed me. I saw my name clear and bold on every page. He was asking for an emergency injunction, freezing my accounts, revoking any rights Mark had to enter my home, and requesting that a protective order be put in place. I signed every form, careful and slow, my hand trembling only once as I finished the last page. I left the envelope at the front desk for Mr. Daniels to pick up in the morning. Then I lay on the stiff mattress, eyes fixed on the ceiling, waiting for daylight. By sunrise, the hotel room was filled with pale gold light. Mr. Daniels called, telling me he was outside. I met him on the sidewalk, grateful for the warmth of his handshake and the coffee he pressed into my hand. He walked me through the next steps, what would happen at the courthouse, what to expect from Mark. We drove together, joined by 2 officers who would be there to make sure everything went smoothly. The city looked familiar but strange after so long away, every street corner tugging at an old memory. Every storefront reminding me of errands I used to run with James, grocery lists in hand. Mark skipping along beside me. At the courthouse, I sat beside Mr. Daniels while he explained my side to the judge. I answered each question as clearly as I could, describing how Mark had left me in Rome, how he'd tried to take over my affairs, how he'd convinced others I couldn't manage on my own. The judge listened quietly, his eyes soft but sharp, and when he was finished, he signed the orders Mr. Daniels had prepared. I left the building feeling steadier than I had in weeks. It was nearly noon by the time we pulled into my driveway. The porch light, which I'd always left yellow and warm, was cold and blue now, a small detail, but it stung. The hydrangeas I'd planted last spring drooped in their beds, leaves curling from neglect. I watched the officers walk ahead, their backs broad and reassuring, and I stood with Mr. Daniels looking at the front steps where Mark used to sit with his lunchbox waiting for me to come home from work. The door opened on the 3rd knock. Mark stood there, unshaven and disheveled, his eyes wide when he saw the police. He tried to speak, but I stepped forward, folder in hand, and handed him the court order. Mr. Daniels spoke in a calm, steady voice, telling Mark he was required to leave immediately, that he no longer had access to my accounts, my home, or anything that belonged to me. Mark's face shifted from shock to anger, but the officers stayed at his side until he gathered his things and walked out. I didn't say anything. There was nothing left to explain. I stepped inside, breathing in the familiar scent of lemon polish and old books. The house was still mine, the walls still hung with the photographs I'd collected over a lifetime. I went from room to room, checking every window, every drawer. In the bedroom, I found my jewelry box, undisturbed, the bracelet still tucked inside the trust papers exactly where I'd left them. I sat on the bed, feeling the tension seep out of my shoulders, and listened to the quiet of my home settling back around me. The morning after Mark left the house felt quieter than I remembered. Sunlight spilled across the kitchen floor, touching the familiar pattern of blue and white tiles James had chosen so many years ago. I moved slowly, refilling the bird feeder, straightening a picture frame in the hallway, checking the mail that had piled up while I was gone. Each small task brought the house back to me, room by room, memory by memory. I called Martha and told her I was home. She promised to bring by groceries later that afternoon, her voice steady and sure. Around mid-morning, Mr. Daniels called. "Helen, I've just left the courthouse. The judge has made the restraining order permanent. Mark can't come near the house or your accounts." He spoke with a calm that steadied me. I thanked him, hung up, and sat for a long moment at the kitchen table. Hands wrapped around my coffee mug, watching the sunlight drift across the walls. Everything was moving forward piece by piece. By noon, the calls started coming in, first from my niece Claire, then from my brother-in-law Walter. Both of them had seen the emails Mark sent, the claims about my memory and my health. Martha had shown them the bank records, the proof that Mark had made withdrawals without my permission, the video Claire's daughter filmed of Mark rifling through my house. One by one, they began to understand what had happened. "We're sorry," Claire said. "We should have asked you first." I told her not to worry. The truth has a way of rising, even if it takes its time. The days that followed blurred together. Mr. Daniels handled every detail, calling the banks, securing the trust, speaking to the judge. Mark's petition for power of attorney was struck down almost immediately. The judge saw through the forged notes and the sudden claims about my instability. The restraining order was extended. Mark's access to every account, every asset, was revoked. I watched from a distance as his world narrowed. His employer, a local consulting firm, called to ask about the fraud allegations. When the truth came out, they let him go. Friends stopped calling. His wife packed up the children and left, unwilling to follow him any further. I heard from Claire that he'd moved into a motel outside of town. His silver sedan was seen parked in the lot day after day. I didn't reach out to Mark. There was nothing left to say. I kept to my routines, making tea in the evenings, tending the hydrangeas, dusting the shelves. For the first time in years, I felt safe in my own home. Each night, I locked the doors and sat by the window, watching the sun go down over the backyard, remembering how James and I used to sit together in that same spot, his hand folded over mine. One afternoon, a letter arrived. It was from Mark. I recognized his handwriting before I opened it. The note inside was short, angry at first, then pleading. He blamed me for what had happened, told me I'd ruined his life, asked if I could help him just this once. I sat with the letter for a long time before folding it up and placing it in the back of my drawer. I made no reply. Mr. Daniels called again a few days later. "It's over, Helen. The judge has restored full control. Your home, your accounts, everything is safe." He sounded almost relieved. I thanked him and hung up, sitting quietly at the kitchen table. Outside, the sparrows darted among the hydrangeas, their wings flashing in the sun. The mailbox was empty. The porch light glowed warm and yellow, and the house felt like it belonged to me again. I lit a lavender candle in the living room and let the soft scent fill the space. The old routines were comforting, the way the boards creaked when I walked to the back door, the hum of the refrigerator, the way the afternoon light caught the edge of James's favorite chair. Mark's world had grown smaller, with every lie uncovered, every truth made clear. I didn't take pleasure in his losses, but I couldn't carry the weight of his choices for him anymore. There was nothing left to fear. The weeks after the final hearing settled into a gentle routine. Each morning, I woke early, drew the curtains open, and stood for a while, just watching the slow play of sunlight over the yard. The hydrangeas began to bloom again, stubborn blue, against the memory of neglect. I swept the porch, checked the mailbox, and set a fresh pot of coffee to brew small habits, quiet signs that life was finding its shape again. The legal work that had hung over my head for so long was finally finished. Mr. Daniels called to let me know the last filings had been processed. "It's all done, Helen," he said. "No more loose ends." I felt something inside me settle, a feeling as steady as the floorboards beneath my feet. There would be no more court dates, no more letters from Mark's lawyers, no more sudden calls in the night. I could lock my doors without worrying who might walk in. Martha visited most afternoons, bringing fresh eggs from her hens or a bag of oranges from the stand down the road. Sometimes she came with Claire, who always had a story to tell and a cheerful wave for the neighbors. The house filled with the warm noise of laughter, and for the first time in years, I didn't flinch at the sound of the doorbell. Claire's mother stopped by as well, offering a plate of lemon bars and quiet words of support. She told me that the whole neighborhood had seen how Mark came and went during those weeks. She said the video her daughter had captured made all the difference in court. We sat on the porch swing, sipping sweet tea, and watched the late afternoon shadows stretch across the lawn. Not long after a letter arrived from the court. The judge had extended the restraining order permanently, citing Mark's persistent disregard for lawful boundaries. The language was official, but the meaning was clear. He would not be coming back to this house, not for the keys, not for the trust, not for any of it. I placed the order in the lockbox with the deed to the house, the insurance papers, and the old photographs James had always kept tucked away. Mark tried for a while to find sympathy where he could. He wrote long emails to distant cousins telling them he'd been wronged, that he was only trying to help me. But Martha and Claire shared the evidence with anyone who asked. The truth made its way through the family quiet and firm. Messages from old friends trickled away, his name fading from the invitations and the holiday cards. The job he lost was not replaced, and the car that once gleamed in my driveway sat unused outside a rundown motel on the edge of town. I didn't celebrate Mark's losses. I moved through my days as I always had, tending the garden, baking bread, sitting with Martha by the window to watch the evening sky. I put new bulbs in the porch light, bringing back the warm, yellow glow I'd always loved. The house felt like mine again, each room holding memories I was ready to keep. When I sat down at my kitchen table with a pen and a stack of blank cards, I wrote thank you notes to Mr. Daniels, to the officers who stood by my side, to Linda in Rome, whose kindness had helped me find my way home. The world felt smaller now, but steadier, full of quiet reminders that I was not alone. As the days passed, the weight of everything that happened began to lift. The court had spoken, the family understood, and my home was secure. There was still a sadness for what was lost, but in its place grew something that felt a lot like peace. The summer morning broke quiet and gentle, the kind of peace I hadn't known in a long time. I woke early and moved through the house barefoot, running my hand along the cool banister, feeling the grooves and knots in the wood. Out on the porch, the old swing weighted the seat warm from the sun and the memory of so many afternoons with James sharing stories or just listening to the birds. I settled in with a cup of tea, watching the sparrows gather at the feeder, the garden blooming brighter with every day that passed. Inside, the house felt different, lighter somehow. The walls no longer echoed with the tension that had filled them for months. The kitchen was mine again, the photos along the hallway lined up just as I liked. The lavender candle I'd lit the night before still carried its scent through the rooms, soft and familiar. I thought of the people who had helped me find my way back, Martha, who checked on my house and never doubted me. Linda, whose kindness in a foreign cafe had changed everything. Mr. Daniels, who stood beside me when my own family would not. The official letter from the court rested in the lockbox tucked away with the deed and insurance papers. The judge's words were clear: my home, my accounts, my life were all protected now. Mark's name didn't appear on any of it anymore. There was sadness in that, but relief too. I understood now that love alone isn't always enough to keep a person close or keep a heart from turning. I'd spent years holding on to hope that Mark would remember the woman who raised him, but I also learned how to let go for the sake of my own peace. The days moved slowly, sweet and steady. Martha brought by fresh corn from the market, and we sat together on the porch, talking about small things. The neighbors stopped in from time to time, dropping off jars of honey or just waving from the street. Evenings grew longer, the sun lingering over the garden, and sometimes I'd catch myself humming a tune from childhood, the kind my mother used to sing when she was folding laundry in the back room. There were still hard moments, and sometimes I would find a letter or a photograph that brought the ache back for a while. But each day I felt more like myself, stronger for what I'd come through, steadier in the quiet I'd earned. What I know now is this: dignity can be lost quietly, little by little, when you give up your say in your own story. But it can also be reclaimed, even if it means standing alone, even if the world feels too big for one person to face. I learned that help can come from unexpected places, and that kindness, even from a stranger, can be the bridge back home. There is power in knowing your own worth, power in drawing a line and choosing peace over old pain. As I look out over the yard, the light just beginning to soften, I am grateful for the second chance to fill this house with warmth. I may not have changed my son's heart, but I've kept my own. That is enough. If this story found a place in your heart, I hope you'll share it with someone who needs to hear they aren't alone. And if you'd like to join me again, don't forget to follow or leave a note in the comments. I'd love to know your story too.